morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 7, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Officer Daniel Hayes adjusted his uniform tie for the third time, his calloused fingers betraying the nervousness he fought to hide. Beside him, Rex lay in perfect positional, disciplined every inch. The professional canine officer he'd been trained to be, the German Shepherd's coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his dark eyes scanning the room with the methodical precision that had made him legendary in the precinct. Daniel had testified in dozens of trials over his 15-year career, but something felt different today. The air seemed thicker, charged with an electricity that made his skin crawl. Perhaps it was the gravity of the case, a brutal home invasion that had left 2 people dead and a family shattered, or maybe it was the defendant, Marcus Kelly, whose cold stares seemed to pierce through everyone in the room like shards of ice. All rise. The bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. The Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison, presiding. The packed courtroom rose as one, the rustle of fabric and shuffle of feet, creating a symphony of anticipation. Judge Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, took her seat behind the imposing bench. Her gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to split the silence in half. Be seated, she commanded, and 200 people settled into their chairs with military precision. Daniel felt Rex tense beside him, the dog's muscles coiling like springs. It was subtle, a shift that most people would miss entirely, but Daniel had worked with Rex for 7 years. He knew every twitch, every breath, every micro-expression that crossed his partner's intelligent face. Something was wrong. The prosecution made their opening statements first, painting a picture of senseless violence and cold-blooded murder. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen spoke with quiet authority, her words cutting through the courtroom like a surgeon's scalpel. She outlined the evidence methodically: fingerprints, DNA, witness testimony, and the crucial drug detection that Rex had performed at the scene. Daniel remembered that night with crystalline clarity. The call had come in at 2:47 a.m. Shots fired, multiple victims, suspect still at large. He and Rex had arrived as backup, their squad car sliding to a stop behind the wall of flashing red and blue lights that had already cordoned off the suburban home. The acrid smell of gunpowder had hung in the air like a fog, mixing with something else. Something that had made Rex's nostrils flare and his tail go rigid inside the house. Chaos, blood splattered across family photos, furniture overturned, lives destroyed in mere minutes. But Rex had immediately locked onto something the human officers had missed. His nose led them to a hidden compartment behind the kitchen wall where they'd found 3 kilograms of pure heroin, enough to suggest this wasn't a random home invasion, but something far more sinister. The state calls Officer Daniel Hayes to the stand. Daniel rose, his hand instinctively moving to touch Rex's head. "Stay," he whispered, though he knew the command was unnecessary. Rex would wait for him if it took all day. The oath, the questions, the careful reconstruction of that terrible night. It all blurred together in a routine Daniel had performed countless times. He spoke about the crime scene, about Rex's training and certifications, about the moment his partner had detected the hidden narcotics. Standard testimony, professional and precise. But then the defense attorney stood up. The man was younger than Daniel had expected, maybe early 40s, with perfectly styled brown hair and a suit that probably cost more than Daniel made in a month. His name was Jonathan Pierce, and his reputation preceded him, a high-powered criminal defense attorney who specialized in getting dangerous people back on the streets. His smile was practiced, confident, the kind that had probably swayed 1,000 juries. "Good afternoon, Officer Hayes," Pierce said, his voice smooth as silk. "I have just a few questions about your dog's so-called detection." That night, that's when Rex growled. It started low, barely audible, a rumbled deep in the German Shepherd's chest that vibrated through the quiet courtroom like distant thunder. Daniel felt it more than heard it, a tremor that ran up through the floor and into his bones. Every head in the room turned toward the sound, confusion rippling through the gallery. Pierce paused mid-sentence, his confident smile flickering like a candle in the wind. "Is your dog quite all right, officer?" Daniel looked down at Rex, bewildered. His partner sat in perfect position, but every line of his body screamed tension. The dog's ears were pinned back, his dark eyes locked on Pierce with an intensity that Daniel had only seen once before, the night they'd cornered an armed suspect in a warehouse, and Rex had sensed danger seconds before gunfire erupted. "Rex, quiet," Daniel commanded softly, but the growl continued, growing slightly louder. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked against the wood. "Officer Hayes, please control your animal or I'll have him removed from my courtroom." "Yes, Your Honor, I apologize." Daniel reached down to place a calming hand on Rex's shoulder, but the dog's muscles remained coiled, his gaze never leaving Pierce. The defense attorney recovered quickly, his professional mask sliding back into place. "As I was saying, Officer Hayes, how can you be certain your dog detected narcotics and not simply household chemicals? Cleaning supplies, perhaps?" Standard cross-examination tactics designed to cast doubt on canine reliability. Daniel had fielded these questions hundreds of times, but he found himself struggling to concentrate. Rex's behavior was completely out of character. The dog had been trained to remain neutral in courtrooms, to ignore distractions, to focus solely on his handler's commands. So why was he growling at the defense attorney? Rex is certified by the National Police Canine Association, Daniel replied, his voice steady, despite his confusion. His accuracy rate in controlled tests exceeds 97%. When he alerts on narcotics, we can be confident. Another growl louder. This time Rex's hackles began to rise, the fur along his spine standing up like a mohawk. Several jurors leaned back in their seats, and Daniel heard someone in the gallery whisper, "What's wrong with that dog?" Pierce took a step closer to the witness stand, and Rex's response was immediate and unmistakable. The growl became a snarl, lips pulling back to reveal white fangs. The German Shepherd rose to his feet, his body language screaming aggression in a way that made Daniel's blood run cold. "Rex down." The command cracked like a whip, and Rex immediately dropped to the floor, but his eyes never left. Pierce, the growling stopped, but the tension in the room had multiplied tenfold. Judge Morrison's face had turned red. "Officer Hayes, one more outburst from your dog and I'll hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal clear, Your Honor." But as Pierce resumed his questioning, Daniel's mind raced. In 7 years of partnership, Rex had never reacted to anyone this way without cause. The dog's instincts were legendary. He'd detected explosives that bomb squads had missed, found drugs hidden in places no human would think to look, and once, memorably, had refused to let Daniel enter a building that collapsed 20 minutes later due to structural damage. No one had noticed. Rex didn't make mistakes, and he didn't growl at innocent people. So, what was it about Jonathan Pierce that had triggered every alarm bell in his partner's highly trained senses? As the cross-examination continued, Daniel found himself studying the defense attorney with new eyes. Pierce moved with the fluid confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way, his questions sharp and precisely targeted, but there was something else, something that nagged at the edge of Daniel's consciousness, like a word on the tip of his tongue. The way Pierce held his left hand, favoring it slightly, the small scar just visible above his collar. The scent, because Rex was always about scent that lingered in the air. Whenever the man moved closer, Daniel had smelled that scent before that night 7 months ago when they'd found the heroin and the bodies. It had been faint, then barely detectable even to Rex's sensitive nose, masked by gunpowder and blood and death. But it had been there, clinging to the edges of the crime scene like a ghost, and now it was here in this courtroom, radiating from the man who was supposed to be seeking justice for the accused. The implications hit Daniel like a physical blow. If Rex was right, and Rex was always right, then Jonathan Pierce wasn't just defending Marcus Kelly. He was connected to the crime itself, standing in this courtroom not as an officer of the court, but as a participant in the very murders he claimed to be investigating. As Pierce finished his cross-examination and returned to his table, Rex's body finally relaxed, but his eyes never wavered. The dog knew. Somehow, in that instinctual way that defied human understanding, Rex had identified the real enemy in the room. Daniel stepped down from the witness stand on trembling legs, his mind spinning with possibilities too terrible to contemplate. As he took his seat, Rex pressed against his leg, not seeking comfort but offering it the way he always did when Daniel was facing something dangerous. Judge Morrison called for a recess, or gavel echoing through the courtroom one final time before the room erupted in conversation, but Daniel barely heard the noise. All he could think about was the look in Rex's eyes and the certainty that this trial was about to become something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The truth was sitting at the defense table, wearing a $1,000 suit and a practiced smile, and Rex was the only one brave enough to growl about it. The courthouse cafeteria hummed with the usual lunchtime chatter, but Daniel sat alone at a corner table, mechanically spooning soup he couldn't taste while his mind churned through the morning's events. Rex lay beside his chair, the picture of calm professionalism, but Daniel could feel the tension radiating from his partner like heat from a furnace. 7 months. 7 months since that blood-soaked night had changed everything. Daniel closed his eyes and let himself remember. Really remember, not the sanitized version he'd told on the witness stand, but the raw, unfiltered truth of what had happened at 1247 Maple Street. The Hendricks family had seemed so normal from the outside. Suburban house, 2-car garage, kids, bicycles scattered on the front lawn. Tom Hendricks worked in insurance. His wife Maria taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. Their teenage son Jake played varsity basketball, and their daughter Emma had just started high school. The kind of all-American family you'd see in a Norman Rockwell painting, until someone kicked in their front door at 2:15 a.m. and executed Tom and Maria in their bed. Daniel and Rex had arrived 15 minutes after the first responders. Their squad car crunching over broken glass in the driveway. The scene inside had been a masterclass in controlled violence, surgical, efficient, designed to send a message. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no evidence that the victims had even known what was coming. But Rex had known something was off from the moment they'd crossed the threshold. The German Shepherd's behavior had been subtle at first, a slight hesitation in his gait, his nose working overtime, ears pricked forward at an angle that Daniel recognized as his partner's "something's not right" posture. While the crime scene techs photographed blood spatter, and the detectives interviewed the traumatized children who'd hidden in a closet during the murders, Rex had methodically worked the house kitchen first, then the living room up the stairs to the bedrooms and finally back down to the basement. His nose led him to places the human investigators hadn't thought to check: behind picture frames, inside air vents, underneath loose floorboards. And then, in the kitchen, he'd frozen. The alert was unmistakable. Rex's entire body went rigid, his nose pointing like a compass needle toward the wall behind the stove. Daniel had called over Detective Sarah Martinez, and together they'd discovered the false panel that concealed a hiding space large enough to hold a small arsenal. Instead, they'd found the heroin, 3 kilograms of pure product worth maybe $500,000 on the street, enough to transform a brutal home invasion into something far more complex and dangerous. But it was what they'd found with the drugs that still haunted Daniel's dreams: a cell phone, cheap, disposable, the kind drug dealers use for a few weeks before throwing them away. It should have been wiped clean, empty of any useful information. Should have been. Instead, it had contained a single text message sent just hours before the murders. Package secured, cleanup scheduled for tonight. JP, Jonathan Pierce. Daniel had stared at those initials for a long time, even as Detective Martinez bagged the phone as evidence. At the time, he'd assumed it was just a coincidence. How many people had the initials JP, after all? Hundreds, maybe thousands in the city alone. But Rex had known better than even 7 months ago. The dog had reacted strangely to that phone, not the excited alert he gave for drugs, but something else. Low whine hackles raised, the kind of response he reserved for immediate threats. Daniel had attributed it to the stress of the crime scene, the lingering scent of violence and death that permeated the house. Now he realized Rex had been trying to warn him. Rough morning. Daniel looked up to find Detective Martinez sliding into the seat across from him, her own lunch tray balanced precariously as she settled in. Sarah was a 10-year veteran of the force, tough as nails and sharp as a razor. She'd been the lead investigator on the Hendricks case, and Daniel trusted her judgment more than almost anyone else in the department. You could say that Daniel gestured toward Rex, who lifted his head politely to acknowledge Sarah before returning to his vigilant watch of the cafeteria. Rex decided to give his legal opinion during testimony this morning. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Legal opinion? He growled at the defense attorney, loud enough to rattle the windows. Huh? Sarah took a bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. That's not like Rex. He's usually Mr. Professional in court. That's what I thought too. Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. Sarah, do you remember the Hendricks scene? Really remember it? Her expression sharpened. Of course. Why? The cell phone we found with the heroin, the text message JP. Yeah, I remember. We ran down every lead we could think of. John Peterson, James Park, Jennifer Phillips, dead ends. All of them. Sarah's eyes narrowed. What are you thinking, Daniel? The defense attorney's name is Jonathan Pierce. The words hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Sarah set down her sandwich, slowly, her cop instincts engaging with an almost audible click. You think Pierce is connected to the Hendricks murders? I think Rex thinks he's connected, and Rex doesn't make mistakes about people. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving between Daniel and his partner she'd worked with K-9 units before, had seen firsthand how accurate their instincts could be when it came to reading people and situations. The text could be explained away, she said finally. Coincidence, common initials, circumstantial, at best. Any decent lawyer could tear it apart in court. But Rex's reaction today, that's not circumstantial, that's a trained police dog identifying a threat. Sarah pulled out her phone. I'm going to make some calls, see what I can dig up on Pierce. Quietly, Daniel nodded, relief flooding through him. Having Sarah on his side meant everything. She had the resources and the authority to investigate in ways he couldn't. Theorize something else, Daniel said. The scent at the crime scene. Rex picked up something that night, something that didn't belong. I couldn't identify it then, but you smelled it again today. On Pierce, faint, but definitely their cologne, maybe, or aftershave, something distinctive. Sarah stood up, her lunch forgotten. I'll check Pierce's background, see if there are any connections to the Hendricks family or known drug operations. Can you handle court this afternoon without Rex losing his professional composure? Daniel looked down at his partner, who met his gaze with those intelligent dark eyes. I'll do my best, but if Rex smells trouble, I'm not going to ignore it. Good man. Sarah gathered her things. Daniel, be careful if Pierce is connected to this. If he's been playing both sides, he's not going to take kindly to being exposed. After Sarah left, Daniel sat alone with his thoughts and his partner. The cafeteria around them continued its normal rhythm. Courthouse employees grabbing quick lunches, lawyers reviewing notes, witnesses preparing for afternoon testimony, normal people living normal lives, unaware that a potential murderer was sitting in courtroom 7, hiding behind a law degree and a practiced smile. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from the prosecution team. Court resumes at 2 p.m. Are you and Rex ready for redirect? He typed back, ready, but as he walked back toward the courtroom, Rex padding silently beside him, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than a simple criminal trial. Pierce might be wearing the mask of a respectable defense attorney, but underneath, Daniel was beginning to suspect lurked something much darker. The afternoon session would tell them how good Pierce's mask really was and whether Rex's growl had been a warning or a declaration of war. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Courtroom 7, casting long shadows that seemed to reach across the floor like grasping fingers. Daniel took his seat in the gallery, Rex settling beside him with military precision, but he could feel the tension coiling in his partner's muscles. Like a spring wound to tight, Judge Morrison called the court to order, with her customary sharp rap of the gavel, and the prosecution resumed their case. They called the coroner, who testified about the precise nature of the gunshot wounds. They called the crime scene photographer, whose images painted a stark picture of violence and loss. They called Jake Hendricks, now 17 and haunted, who spoke in a barely audible whisper about hearing his parents die through it all. Rex remained calm, professional, the picture of a well-trained police dog, but Daniel noticed the way his partner's ears tracked every movement. Jonathan Pierce made the slight turn of his head whenever the defense attorney shifted in his chair or whispered to his client. Pierce, for his part, seemed to have recovered from the morning's disruption. His objections were perfectly timed, his cross-examinations surgical in their precision. To anyone watching, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a skilled defense attorney doing his job, fighting for his client's rights within the bounds of the law. But Daniel was beginning to see the cracks in the facade. There was the way Pierce's left hand trembled slightly whenever he turned pages in his legal pad, as if he were fighting to maintain control. The faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the courtroom's air conditioning, the way his eyes kept darting toward Rex, as if he could feel the dog's unwavering attention boring into him. Most telling of all was the way Pierce maneuvered around the courtroom. He stayed behind the defendant's table whenever possible, putting maximum distance between himself and Daniel's section of the gallery. When he had to approach the witness stand, his path took him as far from Rex as the courtroom's layout would allow. It was the behavior of a man who knew he was being watched by something that could see through his disguise. The breaking point came during the testimony of Mrs. Eleanor Chen, the Hendricks' elderly neighbor who lived across the street. She was a small bird-like woman in her 70s, with gray hair and thick glasses that magnified her worried eyes. She spoke in a soft voice about seeing a dark sedan parked on the street the night of the murders, about a man in expensive clothes walking away from the house just before the shots were fired. Can you describe this man, Mrs. Chin? The prosecutor asked gently. Tall, maybe 6 feet, well-dressed like a businessman. He walked very quickly, like he was in a hurry. She paused, squinting toward the defense table. He reminded me of that's when Pierce made his mistake. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, with a harsh screech that cut through the quiet courtroom like a blade. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is speculating. It was a reasonable objection. Textbook legal procedure. But the sudden movement, the sharp sound, the way Pierce's voice cracked slightly on the word speculating, it all combined to trigger Rex's protective instincts. It growl started deep in the German Shepherd's chest, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, but this time it didn't stop at a warning. Rex rose to his feet, his hackles standing up like a mohawk, his lips pulling back to reveal gleaming white fangs. The sound that emerged from his throat was something primal, prehistoric, the growl of a wolf defending its pack. A sound that spoke to some ancient part of the human brain that still remembered when such noises meant the difference between life and death. Half the courtroom gasped, several jurors leaned back in their seats, and one woman in the gallery let out a small shriek. Even Judge Morrison's eyes widened in surprise, but it was Pierce's reaction that confirmed everything Daniel had suspected. The defense attorney went dead white, his face draining of color so quickly that Daniel thought he might actually faint. Pierce's hands began to shake visibly, and he took an involuntary step backward, bumping into his own table with enough force to send papers scattering to the floor. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely. Pierce's carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing something underneath that was terrified, guilty, and utterly exposed. His eyes darted around the courtroom like a trapped animal looking for an escape route, and when his gaze met Rex's unwavering stare, he actually flinched. Rex, down, Daniel commanded, putting every ounce of authority he possessed into the words. The German Shepherd immediately dropped to the floor, but his dark eyes never left Pierce, and the low rumble continued to emanate from his chest like distant thunder. Judge Morrison's gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Officer Hayes, control your animal immediately, or I'll have both of you removed from my courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, I apologize. Daniel knelt beside Rex, placing a calming hand on his partner's shoulder, but even as he went through the motions of controlling his dog, his mind was racing. He'd seen Rex react to dangerous people before: drug dealers, armed suspects, criminals of every stripe, but he'd never seen his partner's reaction to anyone quite like his reaction to Pierce. This wasn't just alerting to danger or reacting to a threat, this was recognition. Rex knew Pierce knew his scent, knew what he was capable of, which meant Pierce had been at the Hendricks house that night. The realization hit Daniel like a physical blow. The defense attorney wasn't just connected to the case, he was the case. The murders, the drugs, the elaborate cover-up that had led to Marcus Kelly sitting at the defendant's table, it all traced back to the man who was supposed to be seeking justice. Pierce had managed to compose himself somewhat, straightening his tie and gathering the scattered papers from the floor, but the damage was done. Several jurors were staring at him with obvious suspicion, and even Judge Morrison was watching him with new eyes. Mr. Pierce, the judge said coldly, I believe you had an objection. Yes, Your Honor. Pierce's voice was steadier now, but Daniel could hear the strain underneath. The witness is speculating about the identity of the person she claims to have seen. Sustained, Judge Morrison ruled, but her tone suggested she found the objection less compelling than she had moments earlier. Mrs. Chen looked confused by the interruption, glancing between Pierce and the prosecutor with the bewildered expression of someone who'd missed something important. But she continued her testimony, describing the mysterious figure she'd seen fleeing the scene. Daniel barely heard the rest of the old woman's statement. His attention was fixed on Pierce, who had returned to his seat but couldn't seem to settle. The defense attorney kept shifting in his chair, adjusting his papers, checking his watch. All the nervous tics of a man fighting to maintain control while his carefully constructed world crumbled around him. More importantly, Rex remained on high alert, even lying down. The dog's body language screamed tension. His ears were pinned back, his muscles coiled, his breathing shallow and controlled. He looked like a predator preparing to strike, waiting only for the right moment. When court recessed for the day, Daniel waited until most of the crowd had filed out before approaching the prosecution team. Assistant DA Sarah Chen was packing up her files, but she looked up as Daniel approached. Interesting day, she said, quietly glancing toward the defense table where Pierce was having an animated conversation with his client. Rex doesn't usually react that strongly to people, Daniel said, choosing his words carefully. I noticed. Chen's expression was thoughtful. Your dog seems to have very strong opinions about Mr. Pierce. Rex has good instincts about people. Chen nodded slowly. I'll keep that in mind. Thank you, Officer Hayes. You and Rex have been very informative. As Daniel led Rex from the courtroom, he caught sight of Pierce, watching them leave. The defense attorney's mask was back in place, his professional smile restored. But Daniel could see the calculation in his eyes. Pierce was reassessing, trying to determine how much of a threat they represented, which meant he had something to hide, something worth killing for. Outside the courthouse, Daniel stopped at the top of the stone steps, breathing in the cool evening air. The city stretched out before them, lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over the urban landscape. It looked peaceful, normal, but Daniel knew better. Somewhere in that sprawl of buildings and streets, the real story of the Hendricks murders was waiting to be uncovered. Rex pressed against his leg, offering the kind of comfort that only came from a partner who'd faced danger at your side. Daniel ran his fingers through the German Shepherd's thick coat, grateful for the unwavering loyalty that had never failed him. What do you say, boy? Daniel murmured, ready to catch a killer. Rex's answering bark echoed off the courthouse walls, like a promise to hunt. Was on Daniel's apartment felt smaller than usual. At 2:30 a.m., the walls seeming to close in as he sat hunched over his kitchen table, surrounded by case files, photographs, and the detritus of 7 months' worth of investigation. Rex lay nearby, but the German Shepherd was restless, rising every few minutes to pace the small living room before returning to his post beside Daniel's chair. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Daniel barely noticed as he spread crime scene photos across the scarred wooden surface. The Hendricks house stared back at him in stark black and white blood spatter patterns, overturned furniture, the carefully staged chaos of a home invasion gone wrong. Except it hadn't gone wrong, not from the killer's perspective. Daniel had been thinking about it all night, turning the pieces over in his mind like a puzzle with half the parts missing. The murders had been too clean to professional Tom and Maria Hendricks had been executed with military precision. 2 shots each, center mass, no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. The killer had known exactly where to find them, exactly how to incapacitate them before they could react. That suggested inside knowledge, someone who knew the family's routines, their bedroom layout, their security measures, someone who could walk into their house like he belonged there, someone like their lawyer. Daniel pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Detective Martinez's number. She answered on the second ring, sounding surprisingly alert for someone who should have been asleep hours ago. Let me guess. Sarah's voice came through the speaker. You can't stop thinking about Pierce. Either tell me you found something more than something. I spent the afternoon digging through financial records, court documents, anything I could get my hands on, legally. The sound of papers rustling came through the phone. Jonathan Pierce has been the Hendricks family attorney for 3 years. Will's estate planning, some minor legal work, nothing that should have put him in contact with drug dealers. Daniel felt his pulse quicken, but Pierce has some very interesting financial irregularities. Large cash deposits over the past year, always just under the federal reporting threshold. His lifestyle doesn't match his declared income. Expensive car, high-end apartment, designer clothes. Either he's the luckiest gambler in the city, or he's getting money from somewhere that doesn't show up on his tax returns. Rex whined softly from his position on the floor, and Daniel reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. Drug money, that's my guess. I also found something else. Pierce represented Marcus Kelly on a previous arrest. 18 months ago, minor drug possession got him off on a technicality. They have a history of the pieces were starting to form a picture, ugly and clear. Pierce hadn't just been the Hendricks lawyer, he'd been their executioner. The drugs found at the scene weren't evidence of the victim's criminal activity. They were Pierce's payment for the hit, and Marcus Kelly wasn't an innocent man caught up in someone else's crime. He was the fall guy, carefully selected and positioned to take the blame while the real killer walked. There's more, Sarah continued. I pulled Pierce's phone records from the night of the murders. Guess where his cell phone pinged at 2:15 a.m.? The cell tower closest to Maple Street. Bingo, he was there. Daniel. He was at that house when those people died. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of vindication and rage wash over him. Rex had known from the very first moment Jonathan Pierce had stood up in that courtroom. Rex had known they were looking at a killer. We need to arrest him, Daniel said. On what grounds? Circumstantial evidence and a dog's intuition. Sarah's voice was frustrated but realistic. Don't get me wrong, I believe you, but Pierce is a lawyer and a smart one. He's going to have explanations for everything, alibis that can't be broken, reasonable doubt. For every piece of evidence we present, then what do? We catch him in the act. If Pierce killed the Hendricks family to cover up his drug operation, he's not going to stop there. There are other people who could expose him, other clients, other witnesses, other loose ends that need to be tied. UPA chill ran down Daniel's spine. You think he's going to kill again? I think he's already planning it. The question is who and how soon. Daniel looked at the crime scene. Photos scattered across his table, his mind racing through possibilities. Who else knew about Pierce's connection to the drug trade? Who else posed a threat to his carefully constructed double life? The answer hit him like a lightning bolt. Telling Archunwat, the neighbor who testified. Today she saw Pierce leaving the Hendricks house that night. She can identify him. Jesus. Sarah's voice was tight with concern. If Pierce realizes she can place him at the sin. Daniel was already moving, grabbing his jacket and service weapon while Rex leaped to his feet, sensing the urgency in his handler's movements. I'm going to Chen's house. Call for backup already on it. Daniel, be careful if Pierce is there, then Rex and I will stop him. Daniel ended the call and clipped Rex's working harness into place. The familiar ritual of preparation, focusing his mind on the task ahead. They'd done this hundreds of times before, responding to calls, pursuing suspects, placing themselves between danger and innocent people. But this time felt different. This time it was personal. The drive to Eleanor Chen's neighborhood took 8 minutes that felt like hours. Daniel pushed his patrol car through the empty streets, emergency lights flashing but sirens silent. No point in announcing their arrival. If Pierce was already there, Rex sat in the passenger seat, perfectly still but radiating alertness, his dark eyes fixed on the road ahead. The Chen house was a modest 2-story colonial setback from the street behind a small front yard. Daniel parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, Rex padding silently beside him. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, most of the windows dark, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the whisper of wind through the trees. But there was a car parked across the street from Chen's house, a dark sedan that matched Mrs. Chen's description from her testimony. Pierce's car. Daniel felt his heart rate spike as he recognized the vehicle. They weren't too late. Pierce was here now, probably inside the house, with the elderly woman who could destroy his freedom with a single identification. Daniel pulled out his phone to call for immediate backup, but before he could dial, Rex went rigid beside him. The German Shepherd had caught a scent, his nose working furiously as he processed information that Daniel's human senses couldn't detect. Rex's body language was unmistakable. Target acquired, threat imminent, ready to engage. A scream shattered the night silence. It came from inside the Chen house, high and terrified, the sound of someone facing their worst nightmare. Daniel didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the front door, Rex matching his pace, stride for stride, both of them focused on the same goal, getting to Eleanor Chen before Pierce could silence her forever. The front door was ajar, hanging open like an invitation to disaster. Daniel drew his service weapon and peered through the gap. Rex pressed against his leg, every muscle coiled for action. Inside he could hear voices, Pierce's smooth baritone and Mrs. Chen's frightened whimpers. They were in the living room, just out of sight, around the corner from the front hallway. Please, Mrs. Chen was saying, I don't understand. Why are you here? What do you want? You saw me that night, Pierce replied, his voice calm and conversational as if they were discussing the weather outside the Hendricks house. You described me in court today. I didn't mean I was just trying to help. The morning of the final day of trial dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Daniel stood outside Courtroom 7, adjusting Rex's working harness one final time before they entered what he hoped would be the last chapter of this twisted case. Word had spread quickly through the courthouse about Pierce's arrest. Whispered conversations filled the hallways, lawyers and clerks clustering together to discuss the unprecedented situation of a defense attorney being charged with murdering the very victims his client was accused of killing. Marcus Kelly had been released on his own recognizance pending a full investigation into Pierce's activities. The young man had stood in the courthouse lobby yesterday afternoon, blinking in the sunlight like someone emerging from a cave, unable to quite comprehend that his nightmare was finally over. But Pierce's arrest had opened a floodgate of questions that still needed answers. How long had he been running drugs through his law practice? How many other crimes had he committed or covered up? How many innocent people like Marcus Kelly had been sacrificed to protect his operation? Detective Martinez was leading a task force to unravel Pierce's network, following financial trails and interviewing clients going back years. It would take months, maybe years, to fully understand the scope of his crimes. For now, though, there was one final piece of business to attend to. Judge Morrison had called a special hearing to formally dismiss the charges against Marcus Kelly and address the extraordinary circumstances that had led to Pierce's exposure. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and courthouse staff who'd come to witness what was already being called the most dramatic reversal in the city's legal history. Daniel and Rex took their usual seats in the gallery, but the atmosphere was completely different from just 3 days ago, where there had been tension and uncertainty. Now there was an electric sense of anticipation. Everyone knew they were about to witness something historic. Judge Morrison entered with her customary stern expression, but Daniel caught a glimpse of something else in her eyes: satisfaction, perhaps, or simply relief that justice was finally being served in her courtroom. "This court is now in session," she announced, her gavel echoing through the packed room. "We are here today to address the matter of the people versus Marcus Kelly and the extraordinary circumstances that have come to light during the course of this trial." The judge's gaze swept across the courtroom, lingering for a moment on Daniel and Rex, before continuing. 3 days ago, I would never have imagined that this case would conclude with the arrest of the defense attorney for the very crimes his client was accused of committing. The revelation that Mr. Jonathan Pierce was not only connected to the murders of Tom and Maria Hendricks, but was in fact their killer, has shocked this court, and I suspect the entire legal community. A murmur ran through the gallery, the kind of subdued excitement that accompanies witnessing history in the making. However, Judge Morrison continued, "I want to make something very clear. This case was not solved by clever legal maneuvering or brilliant detective work, though both played their part. This case was solved by the instincts of a police dog who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice." All eyes turned to Rex, who sat perfectly still beside Daniel's chair, his dark eyes alert and focused on the judge. If the German Shepherd understood that he was the center of attention, he gave no sign. He was simply doing his job, being present and ready for whatever might come. "Next, Officer Hayes," Judge Morrison said, "would you please approach the bench with your partner?" Daniel felt a flutter of nervousness as he stood, Rex immediately rising to match his movement. They walked together down the center aisle of the courtroom, past the rows of spectators, past the empty defense table where Pierce should have been sitting to stand before the judge's imposing bench. "Officer Hayes, in my 30 years on the bench, I have never witnessed anything quite like what transpired in this courtroom," Judge Morrison said. "Your dog's behavior during Mr. Pierce's cross-examination was at the time disruptive and concerning. I nearly held you in contempt." Daniel swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor. However, it has since become clear that Rex was not being disruptive. He was providing testimony. He was identifying a killer who stood in my courtroom, wearing the mask of an officer of the court." The judge's voice carried a note of wonder. "How does one explain such a thing?" "Rex is trained to detect threats, Your Honor. He's also trained to recognize scents and associate them with specific individuals. When he encountered Mr. Pierce in the courtroom, he recognized the scent from the Hendricks crime scene. But that's not all, is it?" Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Your dog didn't just recognize Pierce's scent, he recognized Pierce as a threat to public safety, as someone who didn't belong in this courtroom in the capacity he claimed." Daniel considered the question carefully. "How did you explain the subtle intelligence of a working dog, the way years of partnership created a form of communication that transcended words?" "Rex reads people, Your Honor. It's part of his training, but it's also something deeper. An instinct that allows him to distinguish between those who serve justice and those who pervert it." When he looked at Mr. Pierce, he saw through the disguise to the killer underneath. "Then you trusted that Judge Menev. Learn to trust Rex with my life, Your Honor. His instincts have never led me astray." Judge Morrison nodded slowly, her stern expression softening slightly. "The court would like to acknowledge the extraordinary service provided by Officer Hayes and his partner Rex. Without their dedication and Rex's remarkable instincts, Jonathan Pierce would have continued to evade justice, and Marcus Kelly would have been wrongfully convicted of crimes he did not commit." The judge paused, looking directly at Rex. "I don't know if dogs understand concepts like justice and truth, but I believe this one does. I believe Rex understood that something fundamental was wrong in this courtroom, and he refused to let it stand." A spontaneous round of applause erupted from the gallery, starting slowly but building until the entire courtroom was on its feet, clapping for the German Shepherd who had solved the murder case through sheer determination and unshakable instinct. Rex remained perfectly still throughout the ovation, but Daniel noticed the slight tilt of his head, the way his ears perked forward slightly. Maybe dogs didn't understand applause in the human sense, but Rex certainly understood that something good was happening. "The charges against Marcus Kelly are hereby dismissed with prejudice." Judge Morrison announced when the applause finally died down. This young man has suffered enough for crimes he did not commit, the court extends its sincere apologies for the injustice he has endured. She turned her attention back to Daniel and Rex. As for Officer Hayes and Rex, this court recognizes them as heroes who exemplify the very best of law enforcement. Their courage and dedication have saved an innocent man and brought a killer to justice. The gavel came down one final time, the sharp crack echoing through the courtroom like a period at the end of a long, complicated sentence. Justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and the system had ultimately worked, thanks to the unwavering instincts of a dog who refused to let evil hide behind a badge or a law degree. As Daniel and Rex made their way out of the courtroom, they were surrounded by reporters, lawyers, and well-wishers who wanted to hear more about the remarkable case, but Daniel found himself focusing on a smaller, quieter group. Near the back of the room, Lenore Chen stood with her adult daughter, both women smiling through tears of relief and gratitude. Nearby, Marcus Kelly waited with his family, looking younger than his years, finally free of the shadow that had hung over him for 7 months. Officer Hayes, Mrs. Chen called out, approaching them with careful steps. I wanted to thank you and Rex for saving my life. If you hadn't arrived when you did. Rex saved your life, Daniel corrected gently. I just helped. The elderly woman knelt carefully beside Rex, running her weathered hands through his thick coat. Thank you, she whispered to the German Shepherd. Thank you for not staying quiet. Rex accepted the attention with his usual dignity, his tail wagging slowly as Mrs. Chen scratched behind his ears. In that moment, Daniel was struck by the simple beauty of the interaction. An elderly woman expressing gratitude to the dog who had saved her life, both of them somehow understanding each other across the vast divide between species. And Marcus Kelly approached next, his young face still bearing the strain of 7 months of imprisonment and uncertainty. Don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For 7 months I thought my life was over. I thought I was going to prison for something I didn't. Rex knew you were innocent, Daniel replied. Dogs have a way of seeing the truth when humans get confused by the lie. The crowd in the courtroom gradually dispersed. Daniel and Rex found themselves alone in the hallway outside the courthouse, had returned to its normal rhythm. Lawyers hurrying to other hearings, clerks filing paperwork. The everyday business of justice grinding forward as it always did. Detective Martinez appeared at Daniel's elbow, looking tired but satisfied. Pierce is talking, she said quietly, trying to cut a deal by giving up his associates. Looks like we're going to be busy for a while. Unraveling his network. Good, Daniel said. The more people we can get off the streets, the better. Sarah looked down at Rex, who was sitting patiently at Daniel's side, alert and ready for whatever came next. You know, she said thoughtfully, in all my years as a detective, I've seen a lot of cases solved by forensic evidence, witnessed testimony, confessions, plea bargains, but I've never seen a case solved by a dog's moral compass. Daniel smiled, running his hand along Rex's back. Rex doesn't see the world in terms of evidence or legal precedents. He sees it in terms of right and wrong, good and evil. Sometimes that's exactly what justice needs. Someone who can cut through all the complexity and see the truth. As they walked toward the courthouse exit, Daniel reflected on this strange journey that had brought them to this moment 3 days ago. They'd entered this building expecting to give routine testimony in what seemed like a straightforward murder case. Instead, they'd uncovered a conspiracy, exposed a killer, and saved an innocent man from a lifetime in prison. But perhaps most importantly, they'd proven something that Daniel had always believed, but never quite been able to articulate, that justice wasn't just about laws and procedures and legal technicalities. Sometimes justice was about listening to the quiet voice that knew right from wrong, even when that voice came from a creature who couldn't speak in human words. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting everything in warm golden light. Daniel and Rex descended the stone steps, together, their partnership as strong as ever, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. In the distance, a siren wailed. Another emergency, another call for help, another opportunity to serve and protect. Daniel quickened his pace slightly, Rex matching his stride, both of them eager to get back to work. After all, the city was full of people who needed their help, and somewhere out there injustice was waiting to be corrected by a man and his dog who understood that sometimes the most important testimony came not from human witnesses, but from a loyal partner who refused to let evil go unpunished. Rex's bark echoed off the courthouse walls one final time, not a warning this time, but a declaration, a promise that as long as good people stood up to evil, as long as partners watched each other's backs, and as long as dogs like Rex refused to stay silent in the face of injustice, truth would find a way to surface. The gavel had fallen, justice had been served, and somewhere in the city, other criminals were probably already looking over their shoulders, wondering if they too might one day face the judgment of a German shepherd who could see through their lies to the truth. Beneath, Daniel smiled as he opened the door of their patrol car, Rex leaping into his familiar position in the passenger seat. It was good to be back to normal, if anything about their partnership could ever really be called normal. Come on, partner, Daniel said, starting the engine. Let's go see what other trouble we can get into. Rex's answering bark sounded suspiciously like laughter.